Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Before starting the event, we are going to have an institutional video about the second census of the judiciary power. Have you ever responded to the second census of the judiciary power? The second edition is going to be for us to understand the judges that are part of the Brazilian justice, the social economic profile, and the census is going to understand the level of satisfaction of the work environment and the impacts in your personal life, health, and well-being. And with this answer, CNJ is going to have public policies to strengthen the judiciary, to improve the services that are going to be done, and it only takes 10 minutes to be done. The census happen every 10 years, and your response is very important for us. I have already done my part. I have also done my part. I have also done my part. Do it yourself too. Now, we would like to start the International Conference on Electronic Monitoring, Technology, Ethics, and Rights Provision. So, for those who are participating online, the registration can be done with the QR code that is made available in the beginning of this auditorium, in the entering of this auditorium. And you need to sign your names in the link of YouTube, the YouTube channel. So in the table we have Justice Rosa Weber, the president of CNJ, and accompanied by the National United Nations Development Katina Argueta for Development Programs representatives, and Rafael de Velasco, National Secretary of Penal Policies, representing the justice policies. And we have the participation of Your Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, Minister Justice Rogério Cruz, Councillor Mauro Martins from the National Council of Justice, judges that are going to help, and speakers and public servants, and ladies and gentlemen who are also seeing the streaming of CNJ in YouTube. The present conference has as an objective to provide discussions for the qualification of the Brazilian monitoring, electronic monitoring, debating current technologies, support to this monitoring in the future perspectives of the application of this in the future. For the opening of the session, we have the floor now, Justice Rosa Weber. Good evening, everyone. I would like to greet with a lot of happiness Ms. Katina Argueta, who is the resident representative of the United Nations Development Program, and Mr. Rafael Velasco Brandani, the National Secretary of Penal Policies, in this act representing the Ministry of Justice and Public Security, and a great thank you to Justice Rogério Sketch from the Justice Ministry, Mauro Martins from the Justice Council, all the judges that are here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, all the judges and public servants here with us, and everyone who is here in person or remotely watching this seminar. It's a great satisfaction for us to open this international conference. and with a proposal of topic that is very unique: the electronic monitoring, technology, ethics, and guarantee of rights. It's another brand new event that it was organized by the National Council of Justice through the Department of Monitoring and Surveillance of the imprisonment system through the coordination of Luiz Geraldo Lanfred. It represents in this event an important step for the qualification of the judiciary action and justice itself within a context that the technology acts or should act to resignify the sense of the imprisonment and the alternative forms that the criminal justice administer and monitor in a different way, given that the person that is under this imprisoned system through the electronic monitoring, we have a midterm in between two extremes. The main objective of the present conference, it was already highlighted, is to spread light in this topic and to bring modernity to be able to win over this conceptual and pragmatic view. And the proposal is to do that through deep discussions, through a set of panels that have been carefully thought of regarding the challenges and dilemmas of the electronic monitoring, to employ with science a perspective that we can notice with the monitoring, electronic monitoring, and not only have a sterile control of human bodies. We want to perfect the human system for the apparatus of each individual. Each individual carries a story with its own singularity or with it directly related. This conditions the way that people act, and we need to do that without forgetting that the people that are being monitoring and the way that they are being monitored, they have to fulfill their own rights, and the electronic monitoring causes damages and stigma and a demystification that we should face as well. So to admit them as a penal code, uh, admission, thinking about all of the invasive action that are not necessary for the fulfillment of the judicial action. The electronic monitoring should not make the person feel as if they do not have the rights and conditions of citizenships, and they should only have the individual restriction that this measure brings with it. That's why the monitoring has a presupposition of a permanent calibration and adjustments and conditions, adequation, and pragmatic accomplishment to allow that this judicial measurement is adequate and proportional as a consequence and through the personal responsibility of the person that is being monitored. During these 2 days, we're going to be able to debate the role of the new technologies through the electronic monitoring, the selectivity of the racial and social perspective, the social protection that we need to understand to be able to accompany these practical reviews and the application of the electronic monitoring to face the domestic violence, and other aspects that are important as well. It's also important to highlight that the electronic monitoring is one more tool of penal control and disciplinary control than penal alternative, because it's a restriction of the individual freedom and an intervention of conflicts and violences, although they are to avoid the incarceration of the imprisonment of so many people. So the sense of virtual imprisonment do not escape this metaphor. And this allows us to transform the electronic monitoring in a species of measure that is not just any type of measurement that is um, has any action at all, but it's an isolation within the walls, but that should not forget about the human rights. We need to locate the monitored people while they have this control and surveillance directly to the agencies of the state. But this is only a consequence to the imprisonment, but the state is not free of for providing a service that need to be elementary to the social being that do not provoke more exclusion. The electronic monitoring and imprisonment should not be dealt with as a rule. They will always be measurements of exception. So the judiciary power should be very criterious and consider that the conditions of this subject and the possibility of application of penal measurements that are less damaging. And the electronic monitoring is just to avoid the imprisonment as long as we don't have another alternative of the penal code that is more adequate, or a measure that prestiges the voluntary option as well. At this moment, the society faces a lot of challenges that reorient the interventions that promote from the justice system a reputation that we should debate and improve with practices that have to do with the electronic monitoring to avoid this service from being a source of retrofeeding of stigmas of violence, structural violence and institutional violence, and from the imprisonment system as well. It's necessary to understand that only with the integrated powers, the executive and the judiciary powers, and the companies that provide services of monitoring, and the social protection network, it will be possible for us to have a more efficient and quality measurement. Throughout this conference, we will have the opportunity to hear representatives from the National Secretary of Public Penal Codes and the members of the academic fields, the civil society, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, United States, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and Romania. It's the first time that we gather here in our country professionals and experts and managers that are specialized in this topic to discuss beyond these perceptions that are very elementary in this electronic monitoring. And we're going to do that to have an attentive look to the quality of the service, the consequences, and above all, the care that the person that is being monitored is being subject to. I am sure that the diversity of actors' perspectives and speeches will contribute to the dilemma and paradoxes that are being discussed until this present that were not really well debated. These discussions will build creative solutions and much more effective. I am sure of that. And I'm sure that we're going to be able to contribute to the electronic monitoring of people. That is an option that is more mature for decision making, and that menu that the state provides to monitor the person. And once we align that with the respect of individual guarantees and promoting citizenship, it's necessary right now to talk about CNJ Resolution 412 of 2021, a constructive contribution of this council to the country that counted with the important collaboration of representatives of the previous depend of the public defense attorney and the OAB, or the Bar of Brazil, and a broad dialogue of the different institutions that we promote so much. This normative is important to emphasize that it has established directives and the following of this surveillance of people with the aim, among other aspects, to find a uniformity of services that are executed in a very diverse manner and in a very asymmetric manner in all of the country, and also to have a protocoled, standardized uh, measurement implementation, always considering. And we always need to think about the penal code and the resolution 412 of CNJ. However, has done much more. It has recognized the importance of the multidisciplinary teams in the accomplishment of this penal code, because through them they had a improvement of the justification of incidents and the reproduction of reports and the social inclusion of people that were followed by the centrals of in the electronic monitoring. It was with the worry of having the guidelines implemented in this resolution 412 that the National Council of Justice has promoted in 2022 technical meetings with all of the courts of Brazil. And in these encounters, they had gathered 430 participants or more. And other regional education and capacity building were also made for the services of electronic monitoring, reaching for 500 other professionals. All of this nation, this is being accomplished now with this international. Its apex is it's counting with more than 3,000 subscriptions to this international conference. It demonstrates a lot of interest of people to understand deeply the electronic monitoring through the broad possibilities that it brings to all of us. So I would also like to highlight that this encounter is inserted in the program and in the activities that correspond, making justice, which is an accomplishment of the National Council of Justice with the Program of Development of United Nations, and that counts with the Ministry of Justice, and that justifies and enriches our education on this table. And I also manifest my desire that the discussions that are going to be held here, they can be catalyzers of great changes to have a better structuring of the electronic monitoring, contributing to the construction of a society that is safer and less discriminatory, and that can fulfill the ideals of the democratic right that become north to our institution permanently. I renew here my vows to everyone, and I wish you all a great conference with a lot of success. Thank you so much.
With the word, Dr. Rafael Velasco. Ms. President of the Supreme Justice Court, Rosa Weber, and Minister Flavio Gino, I'm bringing a topic that's of interest of all of us, and I feel pleasure to exchange this moment with Your Excellence. Thank you so much for you both. Dr. Akacha, the representative of the United Nations Program of Development, I'd like to say that I'd like to give you all the support needed for all the advances that you yourself has been doing in the judiciary and in the criminal area. Mr. Secretary Augusto Botelho, I'd like to say from the bottom of my heart, with a very sensible way, um, for alternatives of electronic surveillance. I actually came here to learn and bring my perspective to help all of us to understand the size of this challenge and why it's needed. Today, the guarantees in all the states, they are not treated as an extension needed of the judicial system. The monitored only receives the electronic device and is sent home. And we need more a team of lawyers, psychologists to develop the assistance are so needed for the resocialization and reintegration of these individuals, even if they are being monitored. And most of our states don't do this today. So it's not a very good scenery. So these people go home to wait to return to the environment that led them to commit a crime. So we don't really improve their state. We need to improve all the system and understand the social conditions of this individual and where he is, and also the supervision of all these activities. And I think there is a very bad economy, and I think there is the monitoring, electronic monitoring. So there are hundreds of people in the prison system um, because of minor crimes, and all the people that are watching us today will understand that many people took something from someone without violence or death. So we have in our system uh, 3,000 or 3,000 and a half reais. Sorry.
With all of the control of the services that we could employ, with the assistance that would reach 15% of this value, and this per year is almost 1 billion reais, and we're only talking about one typology without advancing in more complex situations that we can face like the small traffic or the small consumption, where we would not only be dealing with 1,305 people, but it would be 100,000 people. So it would be 100 times more. They need to be adequately treated with a better investment of the public resource and adequate investment to the recovery of these people, and with the elevation of the employment, all of the measures for the social integration, and as a payer of taxes in the least of the hypothesis. So it's in this perspective that we can talk about this and the numbers that we can invest together. So the Ministry of Justice, we need to aid all of the states for them to have multidisciplinary teams that can embrace people that were condemned, that ended up having this conviction. They can have this resocialization opportunity. I trust in the work of all of you, and I am thankful for the discipline that you have. Thank you so much. Have a great conference, because I know that I will take advantage of this ceremony and these presentations for sure. Thank you so much. With the floor, Ms. Katina Arguet.
Good evening. I'd like to greet Excellence Rosa Weber from. I- I'd like to greet all the authorities here present. Ladies and gentlemen, a society more pacified, just and inclusive can only be reached with the strengthening of the institutions that act for the guarantee of its rights, to promote a justice, a focus on the people, to promote peace and its development. The prisonal system is a reflex of the society who built it. The respect of human rights of the prisoners is a good indicator, key indicator of our progress as a nation and society. In this perspective, to act on the challenges, this is a hard word, that surpasses the, the, the prisons, and to work at inclusive development. The system, the penal system, has a final right to promote the conditions to reinsert into the society of its crim criminals. And we have to look the whole thing from the entrance to the exit of these prisoners, and so is very essential. The electronic surveillance has an important part of this cycle, which is a less invasive supervision. It can keep the citizens a more a better way to keep in touch with its family and society. And it's very important to highlight that the electronic monitoring in a country like Brazil, with so many social differences, can and need to work in its individualization of measures, which are considering each case and each vulnerability of the citizens. These technologies have to be done according to the human rights and reinsertion of the people monitored. Considering the importance and the complexity of this theme, a qualified debate through national and international experiences can contribute certainly to the continued improvement of politics and practices related to the um, electronic monitoring. In this perspective, I would like to congratulate the CNJ for this debate and also for its approach with an international view in the next 3 days. I hope that debates and exchanges in the next few days can provide new perspectives around the monitoring, the electronic monitoring around in the country, resulting in approaches even more according to the human rights into the just criminal justice. I'd like to bring a quote from the General United Nations Secretary Ban Ki-moon. Human rights are not privilege to be given or taken. They are inherent of the people and its and all people, and they have to be protected in all means. I quote. I would like to wish a very good event to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank all the speeches, and for now, this opening ceremony is closed. Later, we'll continue with the program.
O Conselho Nacional de Justiça
The Council of Justice, the program Doing Justice, developed many publishing of electronic monitoring. They are available through the QR code. It's manual guides, researches that associated to the reality seen around the country through this program. The products are translated to English and Spanish, and they are ready to be um, spread immediately once internalized and applied in the field. Right now, to the Magna Conference, the challenges of electronic monitoring and AI and probation is in this table. The president of the Council of CNJ, Mauro Martins, the moderator, Minister of Tribunal of Justice, and the panelist, Professor of University of Regina in Canada, Mr. James Gesek. To conduct this work, Mr. Mauro Martins. Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to greet Mr. Uh, Minister Rogério Schiech, Professor James Gasek. It's a great pleasure to be in this very important event. I'd like to thank the presence of both of you and uh, participate in this panel. For me, it's an honor to, to be in this event organized by the Council of CNJ, the challenges and monitoring, electronic monitoring, intelligence, artificial, and probation. Thank you very much for coming to all of you and also those who are watching simultaneously at the YouTube channel of CNJ. The Department of Monitoring and Fiscalization of the Carcerary System has been working together with the judiciary system in the penal area and educational area to understand new ways to and better ways and proportionally to of criminal control. Taking into account the constitution and this context in this program, uh, the beautiful partnership with the United Nations and with the support of the Secretary of Penal Executions and APEN, we are training all the bodies and from the very beginning or to the end of the penal system, promoting the citizenship from all those that go in and out of the system. And the electronic monitoring is a system that needs more improvement in Brazil to achieve its goal and to not to turn instrument to perpetuate crimes and also to improve prisons. Many processes of its implementation I have been seeing. In 2021, the resolution 412 brought directrices and for monitoring of electronic monitoring of people with protocols and adding interlocution of the justicial system and the departments that take care of the electronic devices. The informations of passed, passed by the to the other bodies and all.
The systems of justice, all of these documents can be accessed by you through the QR codes that are made available in the platform of the event. And in this conference, this international conference, we're going to suggest the electronic monitoring through different perspectives, problematizing issues that many times are not considered in the day-to-day practice but that have a lot of applications in the life of people. And to discuss this, it's the scope of this conference. It shows the challenges that we have in this sphere. The electronic monitoring has a potential of helping in the reintegration of individuals, offering the resocialization. And have we reached these objectives? How is the scene in the justice system by the society, by the educational system, and by people that are monitored? To do this debate, it's crucial for us to understand that this is a restrictive measure that is operated through devices that are equipped with technology and tracking that can allow this continuous dislocation, monitoring of people, and it needs to be applied with a lot of parsimony and in the conditions that they don't recommend this issue. Another aspect that is really important is the protection of the data of the people that are being monitored. We need to guarantee that the data that are dealt with, they need to be dealt with privacy, and it's imperative to establish measures that are efficacious, that are effective, and not to leak this data to anyone. And the consentment of the people that are being monitored are principles that are fundamental, that need to be respected in all of the areas of this adoption. And we have the thought that when we adopt this monitoring, we continue fulfilling these issues, and this does not decrease the importance of the monitoring and the artificial intelligence and of the mm, issues regarding imprisonment in Brazil. And we need to improve the measurements that we do in Brazil, looking for particularities and the promotion to justice and the reintegration of all human beings. And it's indispensable for us to discuss this because we need to have a responsible and ethical type of monitoring, the electronic monitoring with artificial intelligence. They need to be standardized with principles of equity and guarantees of rights, and we should avoid the application of it in an indiscriminatory way, assuring that they are used only when it's necessary and in a proportional way to the objectives of the criminal justice. And to face these challenges, it's essential to foster the collaboration of different actors as representatives of the judiciary power, execution power, and together we can develop many practices and policies that consider the public policy and the protection of all of the people that are being monitored with the academic and the civil society. And with this preview, now we're going to listen to James Kasek and then see the provocations and the considerations from Justice Rodrigo Shimak. So James Kasek is an associate professor of the Department of Studies in the Justice in the University of Regina in Canada. He has a lot of publications in the community service, green economy, and the knowledge of justice. He's an author of the book Portable Prisons, Electronic Monitoring and the Creation of Carceral Territory. And and Richard has been a co-author of another book, and the interest is of violence of LGBTQIA plus and the superposition of religious spaces and the imprisonment spheres of the Muslims and the well-being of the imprisoned people. Thank you so much for sharing your views with us and your great review. You have 45 minutes for your talk.
Full. Oh, wonderful. Very much. Excuse me. Thank you very kindly for the warm welcome and introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, speaking to you all at the International Conference on Electronic Monitoring as your opening keynote speaker. I wish to thank Brazil's National Council of Justice and the United Nations Development Program for my invitation to be the opening speaker. And I thank both bodies for what I believe will be an informative conference over the next few days in the lively and lovely city of Brasilia. Of course, I would also like to thank everyone for coming to my talk. Many people begin this sort of talk with an ice-breaking joke about the weather, so I shall do the same. Living in the city of Regina, in the province of Saskatchewan in the country of Canada, I've garnered a deep respect for Canadian winters, which can reach temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius or colder. Yes, that's right, minus 40 degrees Celsius or colder. So being here in Brasilia, where your winters reach a high average temperature of approximately plus 30 degrees Celsius, let's just say I take your winters over my winters any day of the week. But regardless of whether we live in Canada or Brazil, what unites us is our shared warmth and hospitality of guests and newfound friends. And you've made me feel so welcome since I arrived in this beautiful country. Obrigado. The title of my talk this evening is The Challenges of Electronic Monitoring, Past, Present, and Future Considerations. And given the appropriateness of the conference and the diverse array of speakers over the next few days, I can only imagine how timely and warranted these considerations are for us, both within Brazil and around the world. I frame my focus this evening by drawing upon my own criminal justice research, which also is the basis of my recently published book with McGill Queen's University Press, entitled Portable Prisons, Electronic Monitoring and the Creation of Carceral Territory. In the book, I explore the ways in which punishment extends beyond the physical prison space, or carceral space, and leaches out into society through electronic monitoring, or EM, of offenders. As I will discuss later in the talk, reconsidering the nature and scope of EM requires us to support humane solutions to human problems, rather than solely resorting to the carceral fix EM allegedly provides. So as we get started, I want to first provide a roadmap for where we're going to be going over the next 45 minutes or so. I'll begin by offering some past considerations and background that includes a brief overview of what is EM and how this technology frames my thoughts around criminal justice. I'll then outline what I mean by carceral and how it relates to the creation of the carceral state. I'll then share my thoughts on how EM should be considered as a form of carceral territory that fuel the slices of my book that I'll be sharing with you this evening, and also highlight two key criminal justice trends we are witnessing with the expansion of EM. Then I will connect my findings to current and future considerations for probation and rehabilitation, drawing upon my own experiences in the Canadian context. I'll conclude with the discussion of, namely, so what? In other words, of how we might be able to make better sense of EM in its current technological shape and persistence, but also some of the implications for disparate individuals and groups going forward. With the start of the talk this evening, it's important that we understand what exactly is EM. Faced with the problem of prison overcrowding and mass incarceration, many countries have been and continue to consider alternatives to prison sentences. And in an effort to establish more rehabilitative-oriented and less punitive sanctions, the EM of offenders has become touted as one of the primary solutions to burgeoning prison populations. And as a relatively new way of controlling and, some would argue, punishing offenders in the community, EM has been taken up in varying degrees, either as localized experiments or nationwide programs, in more than 24 countries over the last several decades. A wonderful scholar by the name of Mike Nellis defines electronic monitoring as, quote, technology which must be understood as nothing more or less than a form of remote surveillance control, a means of flexibly regulating the spatial and temporal schedules of an offender's life, end quote. The technology has a chameleon-like character of a multi-usable device, considering the enhanced capabilities of monitoring offenders post-conviction and post-release. Generally, the offender has a tag attached to their ankle and is instructed to stay within a close proximity to a transceiver installed in the offender's residence, which continuously transmits radio frequency, RF signals, from the tag to a computer at a distant monitoring and control center via either the landline telephone system, GPS satellite system, or the mobile phone system. And certainly, only time will tell what technological marvels, or perils, the growing interest in artificial intelligence will have on EM. The EM of offenders has become an increasingly complex entity within the expanding carceral state, a notion which I use here to refer to a series of institutional configurations and actors that prioritize punishment, containment, detention, and/or incarceration for treating poverty, marginalization, amongst other things. It is in this interest in the carceral state where I saw my book, Portable Prisons, formulate and materialize. Researched by a wide array of scholars and practitioners, EM has been considered as an alternative to incarceration and, in some cases, an appropriate community sanction for offenders against the use of incarceration. To date, most scholarship and even political engagement has been devoted to examining the effects of imprisonment and especially the phenomenon of mass incarceration in the United States of America. But of course, incarceration has also been a great focus in many places like Canada, Europe, Australasia, and South American countries like Brazil, with EM utilized in various fashions and programs throughout the world. Now, many countries view the attractiveness of EM for policy-related reasons, in terms of it reducing prison population and allegedly recidivism rates. Yet the reduction of these burgeoning populations and rates are not always the result. And certainly, the effectiveness of EM continues to demonstrate mixed concerns and trends and results. The effects of EM have been far-reaching and have entailed consequences for other societal institutions, including local economies, families, communities, political processes, and even democracy-making. The scope and effects of the carceral state are by no means limited to the prison, and increasing proportions of its work are now carried out by private actors. The resiliency of the carceral state owes much to the elasticity of its web, insofar as the various permutations of the carceral state suggest that it is informed by and contours itself around ways in which the economic, political, and social structures of the day interrelate to each other at different moments in time. Such structures then have the ability to hook up to the everyday life of marginalized groups engaging with surveillance technologies. In effect, my book examines the way in which EM, like other technology-driven surveillance and innovation and management innovations, renders carcerality and surveillance commonplace within the legal and regulatory operations of the state. It was here that I proposed that EM exists as a form of carceral territory, an apt frame of reference which geographically contextualizes punishment and superimposes it upon an offender's personal territory, lifestyle, routines, and indirectly their loved ones. In effect, by making the carceral personal, EM effectively extends carceral space into everyday life. By drawing upon disciplines like sociology, criminology, and carceral geography, among many, I supplement the clarion call by researchers for a more detailed and spatial analysis of EM, while giving voice to often unheard and marginalized populations. Rightly so, social sciences have been able to account for and critique the so-called punitive turn we've seen in many nations, characterized not only by the growth in legal state-sanctioned incarceration, where individuals are sentenced to ever longer prison terms and punitive conditions, but also by the extra-penal mass supervision of increasing numbers of people whose lives are now penetrated by the criminal justice system in ways never thought possible before. This has brought about new ways of thinking about geography, the state, and spaces of incarceration, detention, and captivity. Now, the intention of portable prisons was threefold. First, I wanted to investigate how EM was made sense by both offenders in Scotland and EM operators, G4S Scotland, in the nation during my time between 2016 and 2019. Second, by building upon this knowledge, I wanted to examine whether these practices and experiences paralleled aspects of carcerality, and if so, whether EM had the technological and/or punitive capacity to become carceral. And third and final, I wanted to question the ethical implications of EM practices and experiences. If EM is a significant tool of the carceral state, how might we or how should we perceive this going forward? Now, in attempting to answer these questions, we also have to consider and recognize how EM and the growth of the private sector, alongside ethical implications of EM, factor into these current considerations. So, when focusing on the private sector, as my research certainly does, it is clear that this does interpenetrate with my examination of EM as a form of carceral territory and as a tool of the carceral state. Indeed, the question of whether the daily monitoring of offenders should be contracted out to the private sector is still a highly contentious and political debate. While such contracts can be different across countries and jurisdictions, in the US and the UK, for example, we see the private sector involved in the contracted provision of EM in two ways: technology manufacture and service provision, of which the provision of monitoring offenders is separate from existing probation services. However, some organizations can combine both functions. For example, in England and Wales and Scotland, they simply have fully fledged private sector providers contracted out for 5-year periods. State agencies within the US have even tended to buy or loan equipment and to do the monitoring themselves. Many of the business areas where EM and commercial criminal justice now flourish are based upon original developments in the US, but have certainly inspired the development of new commercial crime control markets across the globe. Excuse me. Now, Chris Patterson's research on the development of EM in the context of international developments in private security and penal provision highlights the growth of the, quote, corrections commercial complex. Now, the corrections commercial complex is an endlessly recomposing and amorphous ensemble of profit-driven organizations, all of whom are contracted out to provide services at various levels of state administration. Similarly, James Kilgore refers to such organizations as, quote, carceral conglomerates, companies that reach their investment tentacles into several sectors of the prison industrial complex to garner profits from mass incarceration. The conglomerates, such as Geo Group and Securus Technologies being two examples, seek to penetrate a range of sectors of the carceral state and not just institutional ownership and management. As a result, information, resources, and influence flow between for-profit companies and organizations on the one hand, and professional and federal agencies on the other. Such a complex typically operates without public scrutiny and both lobbies for and exercises enormous influence over corrections policy. And in terms of the ethical implications of EM, little is explicitly written about the ethics of it and community supervision. In Portable Prisons, I argued that it's important to recognize this technology as not value neutral, neither in its technological design nor as a practice. Even the design of the bracelets, both in terms of their appearance as well as their potential technological functions and intentions, have ethical implications. As Mike Nellis and William Below respectively argue, there are many ethical issues to consider that should be addressed in the ongoing development and design of EM both as a technology and as a punishment. Such issues include public risks and risks to the offender, the profit-driven industry of EM, offenders' privacy, the stigmatization caused by the technology, using the home as a place of confinement, and the enforcement of spatial constraint and mobility monitoring to ensure rehabilitation, crime reduction, and deterrence, if that's even possible. Indeed, larger questions concerning whether what works versus what's right cannot nor should not be so easily separated. Further, the data collected by EM technology, coupled with personal privacy of the offender and the practice of interagency collaboration information sharing, can be additional ethical issues to consider. According to Hannah Graham and Jill McIver, in jurisdictions such as several regions in England and Wales, and even in some US states, police either have ease of access to data about or oversee the operation of the EM offenders, including, for example, GPS-based EM. Where an EM initiative is not police-led, the existence of surveillance data generated by GPS tracking may attract increased requests by police for access to that data. Indeed, swift access to information regarding the whereabouts of offenders can be significantly appealing for the data's potential to save police resources, in other words, time and money. Resources that would otherwise be required for routine investigative procedures to find and obtain the same information. However, Nellis warns that some police may come to value the savings and benefits under the rubric of public protection and helping the public purse. Put differently, to value the intelligence gathering investigative capabilities which GPS enables more so than the technology's capacity to potentially assist offenders in compliance and the reductions in reoffending once back in their communities. Therefore, according to Graham and McIver, a balance needs to be struck between stakeholders interested in EM, in which rights, responsibilities, protections, and restrictions should be adequately and appropriately discussed and negotiated if EM is to be legislated and enforced. So now that we have a better understanding of two key criminal justice trends as they relate to EM, let's now discuss three findings from my book, Portable Prisons. So first, my research highlights that according to the respondents that I interviewed in Scotland, there were common sense characteristics of EM as a carceral territory. So viewing their interactions with G4S Scotland as, quote, simple and, quote, straightforward, suggests the lack of concern the respondents had with EM as a practice in punishment. Now, on the surface, this seems appealing. To these respondents, it appeared as a standard procedure that G4S staffers would instruct them of what the respondents can and cannot do while the curfew was in effect. Yet what becomes clear is that such common sense and commonplace perceptions of EM procedures becomes a creative extension of carcerality, inasmuch as the time-space of the home, in other words, space that's compounded with human activity, the diverse humanetic of meanings, and social life together, are then reconfigured to ensure that punishment is imposed upon and sustained within the personal territories of offenders' lives, however minute and banal the punishment may actually appear. Indeed, calibrating the space of the home, as G4S Scotland does through its EM installation procedure into a carceral territory, also speaks to classification of the territory to be imposed upon the home, as well as the acceptance of EM as a legitimate punishment. Walking through each home and each level of the house, as I did with my respondents and through my own shadowing, through my research, the EM technology, especially when we're looking at these personal carceral spaces, are then created within a wider surveillance and carceral circuitry of the state. And furthermore, for both offenders and staffers, this punishment was seen as legitimate when it, quote, made sense in its application. So the ease of communicating the punishment of EM, so knowing that you're going to be tagged to you or to someone's home, the physical and symbolic bounds of the punishment, and the quote-unquote simple conditions required by the offender to ensure that they don't interfere with the carceral territory's continued calibration. So for example, being told that you shouldn't touch the EM box unless we call you, make sure to not touch the receiver unless we tell you, and so on and so forth. These are all significant attributes to ensuring that this particular type of penal measure imposed upon the state is legitimate. Taken together, the commonsensical conditions of the carceral territory renders the personal territory and the life of the offender surveillable and therefore knowable for further private sector and carceral state interests. Secondly, feelings of sticking or being stuck run parallel to aspects of carcerality, which I'll get into in a second. For example, forms of punishment that are not explicitly prison-based can be just as constraining in a different sense as traditional incarceration. I argue that by reconsidering these individuals as stuck, especially when we think of EM and stigma, we begin to shed light on new ethical issues they face when we talk about stigma, with sticking to the time of the curfew, the pains of being stuck in place while their loved ones and their lives remain quote-unquote on the move. Like glue, the adherence of carceral territory leaves behind residue which exacerbates the detriment these marginalized individuals are already experiencing in their lives in the community. The feelings and experiences of being stuck in a state of stuckedness parallels the feelings associated with aspects of carcerality, most notably the detriment of social exclusion, the aggravation and frustration of isolation in the community, the shame and embarrassment of being incarcerated or electronically monitored, and in terms of EM, the annoyances attributed to micromanaging times and schedules before and after curfews. Taken together, the stickiness of carceral territory as a punishment does its part to ensure and enforce offender compliance and ensures that, in varying degrees, the offender feels punished, even within the comfort and confines of their own community. We're also able, and third and finally, through a focus on carceral territory, to witness how EM takes place, not only through the processes and practices of G4S Scotland, so the procedures that are happening, but also the way in which EM territorializes a personal space, rendering particular experiences of detainment, confinement, and carcerality imaginable, and therefore renders understandings of territory beyond a mere spatial carrier or container. In effect, it is clear that these distinctive geographies and personal territories, which comprise offenders' experiences of EM as authentic knowers, need to be recognized in attempts to understand social spatial relations. The point here is that the nature of carceral territory within the home and its purposes do matter to existing scholarship, and they matter intensely. So you might be wondering, what implications does research like mine have upon ongoing expectations and realities of EM implementation, probation, and rehabilitation? Excuse me. Well, where ethics refer to doing things for the right reasons and potentiate coherence and integrity, what it means to care in probation may be difficult to operationalize in certain contexts, but vital to understanding the role and value of practitioners. As technocracy and statecraft mix anew, this environment has created carceral territories marked by strict rules, regulations, and policies, which can devalue the human experience of trust and evoke skepticism and vigilance between probation officer and clientele. As we've seen in countless studies, risk as a metric of performance can foster atmosphere that prioritizes data analytics and profit over people. We must resist such efforts, lest we allow current and future carceral campaigns to advance and gain new ground, new territories, and new lives. Nevertheless, I'm not a counsel of despair, and I still believe all hope is not lost. Probation remains fertile ground for rehabilitation. But how then, as Fergus McNeill posits, do we rehabilitate programming, social structures, and even society? Well, for example, in Canada, rehabilitation is largely ingrained into prevailing systems of risk assessment, specifically the risk need responsivity model, or R&R model. As the name suggests, the R&R model is rooted in three core principles of first, risk, meaning the notion that a person's risk is predictable and should be treated. Secondly, need, that the systems should respond to people's criminogenic needs. And third, responsivity, which refers to the ways treatment should be delivered. Although I recognize the criticisms directed at the R&R model and other forms of risk assessment, as certainly the literature talks about this at great length, I do note Canada is largely reliant on this R&R model and that it informs many official practices across criminal justice institutions. Excuse me. Interestingly, Canada has been described as a carceral outlier in the context of global penal trends, and I'll get to that in a second. Rehabilitation is held strong as guiding sentencing principles alongside the more punitive approaches of deterrence, denunciation, and incapacitation in our country. Even when our country saw more tough-on-crime legislation under our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, we see a lack of appetite for, and even a reluctance to adopt, a tough-on-crime approach even among certain politicians, legal actors, media, and the general public. CARE, perhaps seen as human rights recognition, compassion, empathy, reconciliation for past injustices or traumas, or something in between. CARE is both an ethic for and value of probation. And probation requires both sense and sensitivity to understand what best serves the practitioner-client relationship. Rehabilitation, then, must align with justice work, particularly important in the context of the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, emerging research points to the central role of interagency collaboration and therapeutic alliances between government and community-based non-government organizations for already marginalized and criminalized populations. From lockdown imprisonments to lockdown communities, the pains of continued isolation and exclusion, despite having regained some of their mobility and freedoms, remain significant to understand. Furthermore, while a therapeutic alliance requires agency, the social structures behind homelessness, addiction, poverty, and mental illness, amongst other things, represent building blocks from which first non-criminogenic and then criminogenic needs can be successfully addressed. Now is the time to foster rehabilitative services and support systems for already marginalized and criminalized populations, and this includes greater comprehensive funding for education and the social welfare state. This call to action necessitates an understanding of how a variety of government and non-government organizations active in marginalized neighborhoods see their role and have responded to COVID-19. The goal of this call is to reconsider what these organizations may offer in terms of supporting already marginalized populations in building a resilient post-pandemic infrastructure of services and supports. And at the same time, we need legal controls to be put in place that ensures consistency and objectivity in how EM is implemented, and a clear process of appeal and a complaint allowing for challenge to any individual decision on grounds of proportionality and appropriateness. In the absence of robust interrogation and introspection, it is probable that confluent interests from the commercial, governmental, and civil society sectors will continue to extend the scope of penal supervision in the lives and communities of already marginalized people. If that is the case, it becomes an evasion of the responsibilities of scholars of criminal justice to inform policy communities and the wider public of the foreseeable consequences of decisions taken at least nominally in our name. Not to do this is to leave the market and those whom it empowers to make relatively invisible and unaccountable decisions. As Stanley Cohen made eloquently clear in another context, there are a variety of ways of not knowing or avoiding knowledge about the suffering of others. The challenges then lie in thinking harder about whether the market is or is not an adequate form of public accountability, about the ways the public are or should be further empowered to engage in democratic decision-making, and how evidence-based research can assist the process of public amelioration. Portable Prisons endeavors to address the first two challenges, and it is my hope that we can begin to bridge EM implementation, probation, and rehabilitation to address the third. As a final note, we can clearly see how the costs of carceral expansion now extend well beyond the length of a prison term. The price for the marketization of criminal justice is levied in the lives of the vulnerable, marginalized communities which commercial interests require to make marketization happen. In effect, my research on the intersections between carceral territory and criminal justice continues to endorse more socially conscious and morally charged perceptions of penal affairs. Such penological thinking also incorporates and enriches more capacious conceptions of legitimacy. If we remain at all interested in the assertion that the very purpose of producing knowledge about the social world is to change it, and to progress pro-social change for already marginalized groups in society, then in this spirit, we must continue to question the legitimacy of penal arrangements as they currently stand and where these arrangements are taking us going forward. In closing my keynote speech, I want to give my sincere thanks to you all for joining me this evening, and I look forward to our conversations tonight for the duration of the conference and beyond. Thank you.
Mr. James, I thank you. I deeply thank you for this explanation that you have brought to us uh, around a topic that's extremely important. We live in a country that lives in a big many prisons, hundreds of people that cannot that are in prison, and that makes it very difficult to have a system to execute the law in a dignifying way. And so to think about ways, alternatives for the prisons and measures like electronic monitoring, it's extremely important. I'd like, I see this topic as a fundamental to discuss. I really thank you for these explanations. And I'm going to give the word to Minister Marcelo Schiech. No, I don't need to say much about him. Everybody knows. But making it short, he's a master of from the University of São Paulo and the University of San Francisco, Minister of the Supreme Justice. He's a doctor and presenter of Uninovi. He's author of thousands of dozens of articles guarantee of processual and many different books with the topic in this topic. Minister, the floor is yours. Good evening to all of you. Firstly, I'd like to thank the presentation of Mr. Mauro Martin, our counselor, and congratulations for your acting in this department. I have been following you for a while, and especially on this topic that we are bringing tonight. After this amazing explanation of Mr. James Kasich, I have not much to add, but I'd like to say from my presentation, it has to do with this topic. When I started, when I was a justice promoter, I was a member of the public ministry for 27 years, and at that time, I wasn't very um, happy about how we treated um, things like the use of cautelar imprisonments. So in my book, the Prison Cautelar Drams and Principles and Alternatives book, and in the same way as prison, with the normal way of punishing people, the punishment of the body, we started punishing the soul, and that was made with the imprisonment in prisons, and that was made in the history changed. Before we used to cut pieces of bodies or leave marks, and now we only um, in prisons. This punishment, we see it in a way of reinsert citizens to society, and in not all the cases, well, we need to imprison, we can use the electronic monitoring. And some hypotheses that, for example, for reasons like of need or not need, we could substitute the prison or a fine to put to have a person in a place, maybe in their house, so confining them in a small place with the electronic monitoring and with surveillance around the movement of these people, especially when they cannot go to specific places or access different places, and also as a way to protect to other people in the case of um, domestic violence, other kind of aggressions where uh, electronic monitoring protects the victim against the approach of its aggressor. Not from all on this reason, in other for other reasons, we allow the victim to have these devices and more support of the police for that this situation can be controlled and not have a reversible chaos in these victims. And, and the biggest challenge in Brazil, in my perspective, is how to instrumentalize the the state justice and the national justice overall with this technology. This is not so new, but we have a lot to develop. And normally we say that there's no enough means and materials for buying this equipment, and also human resources, not only to apply these technology and this equipment um, to put it in the prisoner's body and or the condemned person that's but also just as a surveillance of this equipment. And because we don't have the visual of probation, this is normally done in a not in a very proper way, in a way that is a bit or non-scientific or and criterious. And these, and from my opinion, can it means in um, a not a good use of this measure, alternative measure, and also its efficacy. Yeah, so when the prisoner have to have visits of other professionals, such as for surveillances. There are also other examples of lack of product of devices, and yeah, there is a case where they put the device in a dog, and so I don't know if that was true or not, but it's very curious, this story. So we have to think that we have to invest more in this technology, and also another point that the professor mentioned was the ethical aspect of the use of the bracelets. In our case, we put them in their feet. So where should we put it? In our ankle and the arm? How big should it be? I remember that at the beginning. You remember the mobiles? They used to be big and at the beginning, and nowadays they are very discreet. And some says that the prisoner should show the equipment so to let everyone else know that he's being monitored. So there are some stigma of this measure, uh, as well as its punishment has a symbolic value. In some countries, like United States, for example, in some states, we know that they use something like those marks or signs where the prisoner you take around a piece of clothing or a letter showing to show what crime it had been committed for. So there are many crimes against the sexual crimes, and some states they people have to be have a fixed a labeling to understand to show that there's a raper there, something like that. Um, um, I have a habit of collecting pictures of the penitentiary system, and one of them is a man carrying a, a badge, a tag, saying that I'm a thief. So I'm from a time where punishment was not only a way to 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 recover from a crime, but it was to make the person feel bad and to let all the inhabitants of that cities that they could actually come and say bad things or even beat that prisoner. So we have to go ahead developing in a way, civilized way, to punish or to reinsert, because the devices have I mean they want to monitor the prisoners in a nicer way. So yeah, there are many hypotheses. Um, can we, which type of prisoners can we use it? Can we put it using homeless people, people with psychiatrical problems? So these talks help all the law system to understand when and when not to use it. And I've also observed that not always we judge take care of the use of the electronic device for the end it's supposed to be. So maybe it can be substitute for many other alternatives, and we need to understand why of the measures are taken. Sometimes there's no reason for these devices. So if someone did a stelionato, in these cases they don't need it. And in some cases, if they are a house imprisonment, especially for women that have child under 12. Um, so women that are convicted by drug traffic. So the judge thinking that they're doing something good is to leave her at home, but actually he is preventing them to work to bring food to the table. Yeah, so there's other measures that can be taken that can be better. For example, coming to see the judge from time to time. So we have a lot to advance in this way of punishing and repair. I only like to provoke the professor Gasek if he understands that the criminal justice system, like the Brazilian one with its deficits, has the, the possibility of including this measure, like you said, without a structure that are really functional of people that are in charge of surveilling people like the probation officers, but, but that could actually somehow, in a methodical way, do the surveillance, or if we could uh, only improve the technology to not need people in this process of surveillance and monitoring and the use of the device, if it's a bracelet or an ankle. So I would like to bring you this question: if we can actually have a system that we would not need an officer, the probation officer.
Very much for the question. I think it's fascinating. I think that in an ideal world there might be a conversation about probation officers engaging with EM, with electronic monitoring, but I think that also harkens back to the conversation about care, that if we are going to have a better sense of what our justice system, whichever justice system we're talking about, we need to have a better sense of what that care means. And I'm pulling from my research, but my also thoughts from Canada. And when I speak of rehabilitation, there's a conversation about how exactly a comprehensive care looks like, and the value of practitioners is so important. And so, if EM is to be functional, if it's to have value in a justice system, then in terms of my research and longstanding literature, there should be at least some sort of comprehensive care that aligns with that monitoring. So I think it is possible to have, you know, probation officers engaged in that, but they need to be, especially from what I've seen in Canada, they need to be supported. They need to have guidance on what that support should look like. They should be able and free to have a more sympathetic and compassionate relationship with their clientele. So it's even moving away from the idea of the offender, moving to clientele. I think some of these changes, while incremental, can be very important to the work that justice actors are doing right now. So I think there is a way in which to move forward, and I think that if EM can be paired with this rehabilitation, with a better sense of care, then maybe we can start moving that dial towards more compassion. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Thank you very much. Ministro, agradeço.
Your in for intervening. I would like to congratulate you for the way that you have spoken today in the National Court of Justice, and you try to do a jurisprudence that guarantees the federal justice, and that is very important, and the penal process is applicable in accordance to the federal court. And the greatest challenge that we have nowadays is to make judges and courts in Brazil fulfill their goal, their guidelines, everything that was established by the superior courts, and interpret the norms of the Constitution, and really give big guides, and have a guidance to all of the society in a systematic way. It's fundamental for the judges to understand that the system is vertical. And when the Supreme Courts, the superior courts, serve as a north, as um, compass that we can follow, is a stable jurisprudence that we have and that we should respect. I would like to thank Professor James and the Justice. And tomorrow we start at 9 with the role of new technologies in the support of electronic monitoring. I wish you all a great night, and thank you so much.
Temos os pronunciamentos.
So after these talks, this is the end of the first international conference about electronic motor monitoring, ethics and guarantee of rights. The, 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 the event starts tomorrow with the panel, um, the new technologies and support of electronic monitoring.